The sun was starting to set as Officer Tanya Reynolds drove her patrol car slowly through the quiet streets of Oakwood. The sky was painted with streaks of orange and pink, a beautiful end to what had been a pretty ordinary Thursday. Tanya had been on the force for 12 years now, and she knew these streets like the back of her hand. She sipped her lukewarm coffee, grimacing slightly at the bitter taste. The radio crackled with occasional updates from dispatch, but it had been a slow day, just the way she liked it. After responding to a domestic dispute earlier that morning and helping an elderly man find his lost dog in the afternoon, Tanya was looking forward to finishing her shift without any more excitement. As she turned onto Maple Avenue, her trained eyes caught something. A blue sedan rolling through a stop sign without even slowing down. Tanya sighed and set her coffee in the cup holder. It wasn't a big violation, but rules were rules, and stop signs were there for a reason. She flipped on her lights and followed the car. The driver seemed to notice immediately, pulling over to the curb in a smooth, practiced motion. At least they weren't giving her a hard time about it. Some folks would speed up or pretend not to see the flashing lights in their rearview mirror. Tanya radioed in her location and the license plate number before stepping out of her cruiser. The evening air was cool against her face as she approached the vehicle, one hand resting lightly on her belt, as she'd been trained to do. Safety first always. Evening, Tanya called as she reached the driver's side window. License and registration, please. The window rolled down smoothly to reveal a man in his mid-50s. He had gray hair at his temples and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting in the sun. He was wearing a simple button-up shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and his expression was calm as he reached for his wallet. "Evening, officer," he replied, his voice deep and a little rough. "Sorry about that stop sign. I've been driving for hours, and I guess my mind wandered." Tanya nodded but didn't immediately respond. She'd heard every excuse in the book over the years. The trick was to stay professional and not get pulled into unnecessary conversation until she had checked their information. "Been driving long today?" she asked, accepting the license and registration he handed over. "About 6 hours," the man said with a tired smile. "Just moved to town. All my stuff's in the back and in a moving truck that's following tomorrow." Tanya glanced at his license. Richard Thornton, age 54, from Chicago, Illinois. The address listed wouldn't be current anymore if he was telling the truth about moving. "Welcome to Oakwood," she said, her tone remaining professional but not unkind. "Where are you moving from?" "Chicago originally," Richard said, "but I've been all over. Military, then different jobs. Never really settled anywhere for too long." Tanya nodded again and was about to return to her cruiser to run his information when something caught her eye. As Richard had gestured while talking, his sleeve had pulled back slightly, revealing part of what looked like a tattoo on his forearm. Something about that partial image made Tanya's heart skip a beat. She couldn't even tell what the full tattoo was yet, but there was something familiar about the bit she could see. A specific shade of blue ink and what might have been numbers. "Sir, would you mind?" she started to ask, then stopped. A car drove past them, momentarily distracting her. She collected herself. "Would you mind showing me your forearm?" "I noticed you have a tattoo." Richard looked surprised at the unusual request, but complied without complaint. He pushed his sleeve up further, revealing the full design on his skin. Tanya's breath caught in her throat. The world around her seemed to slow down as she stared at the tattoo. It wasn't possible. It couldn't be. But there it was, right in front of her eyes. The clipboard in her hand suddenly felt heavy. Her mouth went dry. For the first time in her 12-year career, Officer Tanya Reynolds found herself completely frozen during a routine traffic stop. For what felt like forever, Tanya stood there staring at the tattoo on Richard's arm. It was a military emblem, specifically a Marine Corps symbol, with a date underneath, 06/12/2005. The numbers seemed to burn into her vision. "Officer, is everything okay?" Richard asked, his voice cutting through the fog in her mind. Tanya blinked rapidly, trying to gather her thoughts. "That tattoo?" she managed to say, pointing with her pen. "The date. What does it mean to you?" Richard's face changed. The polite, slightly tired expression was replaced by something deeper, something heavy with memory. He glanced down at his own arm as if he needed to remind himself what was there. Afghanistan, he said quietly. It was a bad day. A car drove past them, the headlights briefly illuminating Richard's face. Tanya could see lines of grief etched around his eyes that she hadn't noticed before, the kind that come from carrying something heavy for a very long time. Listen, Richard continued, I know I ran that stop sign. I'll take the ticket. It's no problem. But Tanya wasn't thinking about the traffic violation anymore. Her hand trembled slightly as she handed back his license and registration. Could you step out of the car, please? She asked. A flicker of concern crossed Richard's face. Did I do something wrong, officer? No, nothing like that. Please, just step out for a minute. Richard unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out onto the quiet street. He was taller than Tanya had expected, with broad shoulders that spoke of physical strength, even though he was clearly in his 50s. He stood awkwardly by his car, waiting. Tanya took a deep breath. My brother was in Afghanistan. He was a Marine too. Richard's eyes widened slightly. When did he serve? He didn't come home, Tanya said, the words feeling like stones in her mouth. Even after all these years, saying it out loud still hurt. His convoy was hit on June 12, 2005. Richard's face went pale. He leaned back against his car like he needed the support to stay standing. What unit was he in? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. 3rd Battalion, 8th Marines, Tanya replied. Richard closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, they were filled with a recognition that made Tanya's heart pound harder. I was there, he said simply. I was a combat medic attached to that unit. The world seemed to tilt beneath Tanya's feet. Of all the small towns in all the country, this man had driven through hers, had rolled through a stop sign on her patrol route. It didn't seem possible. My brother's name was Danny, she said, Danny Reynolds. The change in Richard's expression told her everything. He knew that name. He remembered her brother. Danny, Richard repeated, his voice thick with emotion. Dark hair. Always carried a little notebook to write letters home. Tears sprang to Tanya's eyes before she could stop them. That tiny detail, the notebook, was something only someone who really knew Danny would remember. He had written to her almost every week, pages filled with stories, observations, and little jokes to make her laugh even while he was surrounded by war. That's him, she whispered. A passing car honked at something up the street, jerking both of them back to their surroundings. They were still standing on the side of the road, a police officer and a driver she'd pulled over. But in the space of a few minutes, everything had changed. Richard looked down at the tattoo on his arm. I got this for them, he said, for all of them. I was the medic on duty when the IED hit. His voice cracked. I did everything I could. Tanya felt her professional demeanor slipping away entirely. The clipboard in her hand now seemed ridiculous, unimportant. The traffic stop, the routine of it all, had been shattered by this impossible coincidence. I think we need to talk, she said finally. Not here on the street. Would you? Would you follow me to the diner around the corner? I'm due for my break anyway. Richard nodded, looking both stunned and somehow relieved. Yeah, he said. I think we do need to talk. The diner on the corner of Main Street was nearly empty when Tanya and Richard walked in. Just a couple of truckers at the counter and an elderly couple sharing pie by the window. The smell of coffee and grilled onions filled the air. A bell jingled as they opened the door. Hey there, Officer Reynolds, called the waitress, a woman in her 60s with hair dyed a bright auburn. The usual. Thanks, Patty, Tanya replied with a nod. Make it 2, please. They slid into a booth near the back. Tanya still wore her uniform, her badge catching the light from the overhead lamp. Richard sat across from her, his hands folded on the laminate tabletop. For a moment, neither spoke. It was as if they both needed time to process the unlikely situation they found themselves in. Patty brought over 2 mugs of coffee and promised to return with a fresh pot of decaf. When she left, Tanya finally broke the silence. So you were there, she said. It wasn't a question. Richard nodded, adding a packet of sugar to his coffee. His hands were steady, but Tanya noticed a slight tightness around his eyes. I was the senior medic on duty that day, he said. We got the call about the convoy being hit, and my team rushed out. It was, he paused, searching for words. It was chaos. Dust everywhere, people shouting. The heat was unbearable. Tanya wrapped her hands around her mug, feeling its warmth. For years, she had imagined that day, had dreamed about it, had wondered exactly what had happened to her brother thousands of miles away. Was he, she swallowed hard, was Danny in pain? Richard looked up at her, his eyes kind but unflinching. No, he said firmly. I got to him quickly. He was unconscious from the blast. We did everything we could, but the damage was, he shook his head. He never woke up, never suffered. Tanya felt tears threatening again that blinked them back. She'd cried enough over the years. Thank you for telling me that, she said quietly. My parents always wondered. Your parents live here too? Richard asked. Dad passed 3 years ago. Mom's in a nursing home just outside town. Her memory isn't what it used to be, but she still puts out Danny's photo every morning. Patty returned with a decaf and a plate of cookies she hadn't ordered. On the house, the waitress said with a sympathetic smile before walking away. Tanya wondered how much of their conversation she had overheard. I knew your brother, Richard said after Patty left. Not well. We weren't in the same unit exactly, but we played cards a few times. He was good. Took $20 off me once. A small smile crossed his face at the memory. He always was lucky at cards, Tanya said, feeling a strange mix of grief and joy at hearing something new about her brother. Used to clean out the whole family at poker nights. Richard laughed softly. That sounds right. He showed me pictures of you all once. His kid sister who became a cop. He was real proud of that. Tanya hadn't known that. The revelation hit her like a physical touch. Really? Oh yeah, he talked about how brave you were for joining the academy, said his little sister was gonna be the toughest cop in town someday. A memory surfaced of Danny ruffling her hair the last time she saw him, telling her to keep the streets safe while he was gone. She had just completed her first year on the force then. After it happened, Richard continued, his voice growing more subdued. I tried to find families, to tell them. I don't know something. That their loved ones weren't alone at the end. But the military doesn't make that easy, and then my own life fell apart for a while. He gestured vaguely with his hand. PTSD, drinking, the usual story. And now you're here, Tanya said, moving to the exact town where Danny grew up. We're at patrol. That's one heck of a coincidence. Richard looked down at his coffee, maybe not entirely. I remembered the town name from Danny's stories. When I needed a fresh start, he shrugged. It sounded nice the way he described it. I never expected to run into his sister though, especially not like this. Tanya felt goosebumps rise on her arms. The universe worked in strange ways sometimes. That stop sign might have been the luckiest traffic violation of your life, she said. Richard smiled at Tanya's comment about the lucky traffic violation. It was a small smile, but genuine. The first real one she'd seen from him. So what now? He asked, wrapping his weathered hands around his coffee mug. I mean, this isn't exactly a normal traffic stop anymore. Tanya checked her watch. She still had 20 minutes left on her break. Tell me more, she said. About Danny, about that day, about anything you remember. For years, all I've had are official reports and letters that stopped coming. Richard nodded slowly, as if gathering his thoughts. He kept a photo of your family in his helmet, he said after a moment. A little worn-out picture. 4 people on a fishing boat. Was that you all? Tanya felt her heart skip. Lake Henderson, she said, summer before he enlisted. Dad caught a bass so big he had it mounted over the fireplace. The memory was vivid. Sunburn on her shoulders, the smell of the lake, Danny pretending to push her overboard. He mentioned that fish, Richard said with a chuckle. Said your dad wouldn't stop talking about it for months. Try years, Tanya corrected, and they both laughed softly. A comfortable silence fell between them. Outside the diner window, cars drove past, their headlights briefly illuminating the booth before moving on. It was fully dark now. I've been carrying it for so long, Richard said suddenly, his voice lower. The weight of that day, the guys I couldn't save. Tanya noticed he was rubbing his thumb over the tattoo, a gesture that seemed unconscious. Is that why you got it? She asked, nodding toward his arm. The tattoo? Richard looked down at his forearm. First anniversary after I got back. I was in a bad place, drinking too much, having nightmares. Thought maybe putting it on my skin would. I don't know, let some of it out somehow. He shook his head. Sounds stupid saying it out loud. It doesn't, Tanya said. Not at all. Her radio crackled, making them both jump. A call about a disturbance downtown, but it wasn't for her. Another officer responded. I should get back on patrol soon, Tanya said reluctantly. Richard nodded in understanding. Of course. But neither of them moved to leave. There was still so much unsaid, so many questions. What about you? Richard asked. After Danny, was that why you became a cop? Tanya considered this. No one had ever asked her so directly before. Partly, she admitted. I was already in the academy when it happened. But afterward, it gave me something to hold on to. A purpose, I guess. Protecting people here since I couldn't protect him there. Richard's eyes showed recognition of that feeling. Makes sense to me. Tanya glanced at her watch again and sighed. I really do have to get back. Right, of course, Richard said, reaching for his wallet. Let me get this. No, it's on me, Tanya insisted. She left a $10 bill on the table, more than enough for their coffees. They stood and walked to the door together. Outside in the parking lot, the night air was cool. Stars were visible above the small town's modest lights. So, Tanya said, suddenly awkward. This wasn't how traffic stops usually ended. Where are you staying? Got a place lined up? Motel on Highway 16 for now, Richard replied. Starting a job at Wilson's Auto Body next week. Then I'll look for something more permanent. Tanya nodded. Wilson was a good guy, fair to his employees. Listen, she said, making a decision. My mom would really... She paused, then started again. Would you want to meet her? She has good days and bad, but hearing about Danny from someone who was there, it would mean the world to her. Richard looked surprised, then touched. I'd be honored, he said simply. Tanya pulled out her notepad, wrote down her number, and handed it to him. Sunday is family dinner. Nothing fancy, just me and Mom, and my husband Tom. 2 o'clock? Richard accepted the paper carefully, like it was something precious. I'll be there, he promised. They parted ways then, Tanya to her patrol car and Richard to his sedan with Chicago plates. As she watched him drive away, carefully stopping at every stop sign, Tanya wondered at the strange paths life took. How tragedy could circle back years later and offer, if not healing exactly, then at least a kind of connection she never expected to find. Sunday came faster than Tanya expected. She spent the morning cleaning her small house, something she normally didn't bother with much. Her husband Tom was supportive but confused by her sudden nervousness. It's just dinner, he said as he helped her set the table, not a state inspection. Tanya gave him a look. This isn't just anyone, Tom. This man was with Danny when he died. He held my brother's hand in his last moments. Tom's expression softened. He put down the plates and wrapped his arms around her. I know, honey. I know how much this means to you. They'd picked up Tanya's mother, Rose, from Pine Valley Nursing Home at noon. At 82, Rose had good days and bad days. Today, thankfully, seemed to be one of the better ones. Her grey hair was neatly combed, and she was wearing the blue cardigan Danny had given her for Christmas the year before he deployed. Who did you say is coming? Rose asked for the third time as she settled into her favorite armchair by the window. His name is Richard, Mom, Tanya explained patiently. He served with Danny in Afghanistan. He just moved to town. Rose's eyes brightened with understanding. Oh, Danny's friend. How wonderful. Then her gaze drifted to the window, lost in thought again. Tom squeezed Tanya's shoulder reassuringly. I'll check on the pot roast. At exactly 2 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Tanya took a deep breath before answering it. Richard stood on the porch looking both nervous and hopeful. He traded his travel clothes for a clean button-up shirt and khaki pants. In his hands was a small bouquet of yellow daisies. I wasn't sure what to bring, he said, offering them to her. The lady at the flower shop said these last longest. They're perfect, Tanya said, accepting them with a smile. Mom loves daisies. She led Richard into the living room where Rose sat by the window. At their entrance, the elderly woman turned, her eyes curious. Mom, this is Richard Thornton. He knew Danny. Rose's face lit up in a way Tanya hadn't seen in years. She straightened in her chair and extended a trembling hand. You knew my boy? She asked, her voice suddenly stronger. Richard approached and gently took her hand. "Yes, ma'am, it's an honor to meet you." Rose patted the couch beside her chair. "Sit, sit, tell me everything. Was he eating enough?" He always forgot to eat when he was busy. Richard sat down, smiling at this motherly concern that transcended years and tragedy. "He ate well, ma'am. Always shared his care packages with the rest of us, though." "That sounds like him," Rose said with a knowing nod. "Never could keep his candy to himself, even as a little boy." As Richard and Rose fell into conversation, Tanya slipped into the kitchen to help Tom. Through the doorway, she could see them talking, her mother more animated than she'd been in months, asking questions and actually listening to the answers. "This was a good idea," Tom said quietly, sliding the pot roast out of the oven. "Look at her." Tanya nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. "I just wish Dad could have met him too." "He's here in his way," Tom replied, nodding toward the fishing photo on the wall, the same one Danny had kept in his helmet. During dinner, Richard shared stories about Danny that made them all laugh, how he'd won the unit's push-up contest, how he could mimic their commanding officer perfectly when the man wasn't around, how he'd once rigged up a makeshift TV antenna using only foil and shoelaces so they could watch a football game. Rose soaked up every word, occasionally reaching out to touch Richard's arm as if to make sure he was real. When he described the memorial service the unit had held for those lost that day, she wept quietly, but they were healing tears. "Thank you," she said, gripping his hand, "for bringing a piece of him back to us." As Tanya watched this scene unfold around her dinner table, her mother connecting with her lost son through this stranger-turned friend, her husband quietly supportive beside her, she felt something shift inside her. A knot of grief that had been tightly wound for years loosened just a little. The world felt less random, less cruel than it had before Richard's car rolled through that stop sign. After that first Sunday dinner, Richard became a regular visitor at Tanya and Tom's home. 2 weeks turned into a month, and soon it felt like he had always been part of their lives. He settled into his job at Wilson's Auto Body, proving himself skilled with engines and honest with customers. People in town started to recognize him, not as the newcomer anymore, but as a neighbor. One rainy Tuesday evening, Tanya's patrol car pulled up outside Wilson's just as Richard was locking up. He waved when he spotted her, jogging through the drizzle to her car window. "Everything okay?" he asked, raindrops clinging to his gray hair. "All good," Tanya replied. "Just finished my shift and saw the lights still on. Thought I'd check if you needed a ride home." Richard smiled at the gesture. "Thanks, let me grab my jacket." As they drove through the quiet streets of Oakwood, windshield wipers marking time between them, Tanya worked up the courage to ask what had been on her mind for days. "Would you come with me to visit Danny's grave this weekend? It's been a while since I've gone, and Mom's not feeling up to it lately." Richard's hands tightened slightly in his lap. He looked out at the rain for a long moment before answering. "I'd be honored," he said finally. "But I should tell you something first." He took a deep breath. "In all these years, I've never visited any of their graves. Not one. Always told myself I wasn't ready." Tanya glanced at him, surprised. "You don't have to." "No, I want to," he interrupted gently. "It's time. More than time." Saturday morning dawned clear and cool. The cemetery sat on a hill overlooking town, peaceful under a canopy of old oak trees. Tanya brought fresh flowers, not formal arrangements, but wildflowers she'd picked from the field behind her house. Danny had always preferred things simple and natural. They walked together between the rows of headstones until they reached the one marked with Danny's name, dates, and the Marine Corps emblem. Richard stood very still, his breathing shallow. "Need a minute?" Tanya asked quietly. He nodded, and she stepped back, giving him space with her brother. Richard knelt slowly by the headstone, his hand reaching out to touch the engraved name. His lips moved silently, words meant only for Danny. When he finally stood and returned to Tanya's side, his eyes were red, but his face looked lighter somehow. "I told him I was sorry it took so long," Richard said as they walked back toward the car. "And that I found his family, just like I promised I would if I made it back." Tanya felt a chill run through her. "You promised him that?" Richard nodded. "In those last moments when I was with him, I told him I'd find his family someday, let them know he wasn't alone." His voice grew softer. I made that promise to all of them, but life got complicated after I came home. Years passed and I never followed through. Until now. They reached the cemetery gate and paused, looking back at the peaceful grounds. Is that why you really came to Oakwood? Tanya asked. It wasn't just because of Danny's stories about the town. Richard's weathered face showed a mix of emotions. I'd like to say I planned it all along, but truth is, when I decided to start over somewhere new, this place came to mind because of those stories. It wasn't until I saw your name tag that first night, Reynolds, that I realized. Then when you mentioned Danny, he shook his head in wonder. Some things just seem meant to be, don't they? On the drive back, they stopped for coffee at the diner where they'd first talked. Patty greeted them like old friends now, bringing their usual orders without asking. You know, Tanya said as they settled into what had become their regular booth, Mom's birthday is next month. The nursing home is letting us use their community room for a small party. Nothing fancy, just cake and family. She stirred her coffee, suddenly feeling shy. We'd love it if you'd come. Richard looked up, surprised. Then a slow smile spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his eyes. Family, huh? He asked softly. Tanya nodded. That's what you've become. For a moment, Richard couldn't speak. He just reached across the table and squeezed her hand in silent gratitude. Sometimes, Tanya thought, the family you find is as important as the family you're born with. 6 months passed in the small town of Oakwood. Seasons changed from summer to fall, leaves turning golden and then dropping from the trees. Winter came with its first gentle snow, blanketing the streets Tanya patrolled each day. Richard had found a small apartment just 3 blocks from Tanya and Tom's house. He'd made it his own, hanging photos on the walls, new ones now, of him with Rose at her birthday party, of him and Tom fishing at the lake, of all of them at Thanksgiving dinner. A life rebuilding, piece by piece. On a cold December morning, Tanya knocked on his door, off-duty and bundled in a thick wool coat. Got something to show you, she said when he answered. Can you come with me? Curious, Richard grabbed his jacket and followed her to her car. They drove in comfortable silence through town, past the high school and the town square with its Christmas decorations, until they reached the nursing home where Rose lived. Mom's having a good week, Tanya explained as they walked through the doors. There's something she wants to give you herself. They found Rose in the community room, sitting near the window. Her face brightened when she saw them. Next to her chair was a large cardboard box. There you are, she said, waving them over. Richard, come sit by me. I've been waiting. Richard took the seat beside her, giving her frail hand a gentle squeeze. What's all this? Rose patted the box. Danny's things. I've been keeping them all these years, but... She looked up at him, eyes clear and determined. Some of them belong with you now. Tanya watched as her mother reached into the box and pulled out a small leather-bound journal. This was his diary from over there. I could never bring myself to read it all. Too painful, but I think he'd want you to have it. Richard accepted the journal with trembling hands. Mrs. Reynolds, I can't. Rose, she corrected him firmly. And yes, you can. You kept your promise to my boy. You found us. Her voice wavered slightly. You brought a part of him home. Next came a faded Marine Corps t-shirt, Danny's favorite watch, and a stack of letters he'd received from his unit after he died, still in their envelopes. I saved everything, Rose explained. Thought maybe someday I'd understand it all better. But now I know that some things aren't meant to be understood, just accepted. When Richard left the nursing home that day, the box of Danny's belongings sat carefully on his back seat. He'd protested, but both Rose and Tanya had insisted. Not giving them away, Rose had said. Just sharing them with family. That evening, Tanya's phone rang. It was Richard, his voice tight with emotion. Can you come over? There's something in Danny's journal you need to see. 20 minutes later, she sat at Richard's kitchen table as he carefully turned the journal pages to an entry dated just 2 weeks before the attack. Read this, he said softly, pointing to a paragraph halfway down. Tanya leaned forward and read her brother's neat handwriting. Had the strangest dream last night. Was back home, but years in the future. Mom was older, Dad was gone. Tanya was a cop just like she always wanted. And there was this guy, someone from my unit, sitting at our dinner table like he belonged there. Can't remember his face, but in the dream, I knew he was watching over them for me. Weird how real it felt. Like seeing a future I won't be part of, but somehow that was okay. Tanya read it twice, then looked up at Richard, her eyes wide. That's impossible. Richard nodded slowly. That's what I thought too. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of Danny's words hanging between them. Do you think? Tanya began, then stopped, unsure how to finish the thought. I don't know what to think, Richard admitted, except that maybe some connections are meant to be, even if we can't explain them. Outside, snow began to fall again, soft flakes drifting past the window. Inside, two people brought together by tragedy, chance, and perhaps something more sat with a journal that seemed to have predicted their meeting years before it happened. Whatever it means, Tanya said finally, I'm glad that stop sign brought you here. Richard smiled, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the tattoo on his arm, the date that had once represented only loss, but now marked the beginning of something neither of them could have imagined. Me too, he said simply. Me too.